Welcome back to War Brothers. We are on chapter 18, Norman Will Die. Oteka crouched down, placed his hand on Jacob's shoulder, and gently gave him a nudge. They will kill your friend tomorrow. Jacob was not asleep. In the distance, he could hear men laughing. Paul had lain back down on the ground, but Jacob thought he might only be pretending to sleep. Who will be killed? Jacob asked. But he already knew that it was Norman. He absolutely knew. The little one. They will make you kill him, but you will all be dead soon. Oteka's whispers were so low that Jacob had to sit up and lean in to hear. How do you know such a thing? Asked Jacob. His voice was even, devoid of panic. Strangely, he felt a sort of relief wash over him. The moment had come. Did you hear the message to the boys from your school on the radio? Yes, Jacob nodded. It was, God bless. It was more than that. It was code. It said, the deal will not be completed. I have listened to the commanders talk. Cooks hear many things. Coney was trying to negotiate with the parents of the boys in your school. Your father is head of the parents' group. Coney wanted guns in exchange for all of you. That is why Coney and Commander Opiro did not want you to go into battle. That is why your lives have been spared. Until now. As he spoke, Oteka kept watch for any movement around him. It made sense. All of it. The boys from the school had been treated in a way that was wrong according to the rules of the rebels. But that was why. They had been spared because they were to be traded. Even the boys from school who had become soldiers did not go into real battle with government soldiers. They attacked villages, or, thought Jacob, trucks filled with defenseless mothers and children. They were never put in real danger. What has gone wrong? Jacob asked. The government stepped in and said that they would not allow the exchange of guns for the students. Everything was arranged, even the pickup of the guns. That is why Coney is so angry. All the brigades had come together to make a big attack. Without the guns, there will be no attack. That is why you are in so much danger. Since there is no arrangement, you are no longer of any use. It has been decided that those students who have not become good soldiers will be killed. Your friend Norman, he will be made an example. Just like Adam, thought Jacob. He gazed up at the trees, still dark. He felt peaceful. Never mind death. His father had not forgotten him. To die, and think that he had been forgotten, would have been the worst death of all. Whatever fate awaited them, it was time to go out and meet it. You and your friend must escape tonight, Oteka whispered. Which friend? He had two friends. But there was another more pressing matter. Do you know where we are? Yes, we are in the park. Murchison Falls, the safari park. I overheard one of the commanders say that we are east of Lake Albert. The leopard, of course. That meant that they were only 100 kilometers away from Gulu. Not in the Sudan, not lost. Why has Coney come so close to the government soldiers? Why has Coney taken such a risk? To Jacob, this made no sense. Tourists come to the park, lots of them, and they pay a lot. If there is any trouble here, the tourists will stop coming, and the government will lose big money. The government wants no trouble in this area. They will not fire on the rebels here, whispered Oteka. Do you know this reserve? Asked Jacob. It's the biggest park in Uganda, but I know it a little, whispered Paul. He had been listening. Paul crawled over now and hunched down between Oteka and Jacob. All three boys looked over their shoulders to see if anyone else was near. My father brought me to the park once. I know where Sambia Lodge is, Paul told them. You must leave now. I am guarding a path that will take you toward the river. I will guide you to the edge of the village. Oteka stood and slung his gun from one shoulder to the other. Jacob stood too, and gently touched Oteka's arm. Lizard suspects something. You are in danger. Come with us. Oteka looked off into the dark, then up at the moon. It was a full moon. Not a good night to run away, and escaping as a group was especially dangerous. There were many soldiers in the camp, many guns, motorcycles, and trucks. Could such a crowd work in their favor? There would be a commotion at dawn, and it might be hours before they were missed, precious hours. Oteka had been biding his time, waiting for a sign from Ada, from his parents, or from God. But what Jacob had said about Lizard was true. Lizard was young, and yet he was gaining power and favor with the commanders. He was especially dangerous, especially violent. A cloud passed over the moon. "It is greedy this night," said Oteka. "I will come. If we are on the right side of the lake, then the lodge is only 10, maybe 15 kilometers away." Paul sounded so sure of himself that neither Oteka nor Jacob questioned him. "And if we are on the wrong side of the river?" Jacob asked. Paul shook his head. The river was filled with Nile crocodiles, some as long as 6 meters, and capable of eating a lion or a human whole. And just as dangerous were the enormous, lumbering hippopotami who fed at night and just before dawn. The whole river came alive at night. If they were on the wrong side of the river, they would have more to worry about than the LRA. "We must go. Follow me." Oteka took the lead. Jacob was ready. He had been ready all along. "You two go on. I will catch up." Instantly, without being told, Oteka knew what Jacob must be thinking. "Your friend Norman is lost. If we are to go, it is now," he hissed. "Paul, go with Oteka. I will find Norman. We will follow." Jacob's words were brave. He felt brave. There was nothing left but bravery. And he was thinking of Hannah. There had to be a way to reach her, to ask her to join them. "No, I will find him," said Oteka. He did not know Norman as Paul and Jacob did, but he understood loyalty. And besides, he carried a gun. He was the cook and had never actually gone into battle, but the commanders valued him, so he was accepted as an LRA soldier. He could stride through the camp without arousing suspicion. Oteka did not wait for Jacob to protest, but set out at once. Jacob wanted to cry out, to tell him, "No, this is my decision." But any noise would have put them all in danger. Paul and Jacob crouched down on their haunches and waited. Frogs croaking, crickets chirping, the piercing cries of bush babies, and the drone of African music pouring out of wind-up radios filled the night. They waited. It seemed like a very long time. Oteka finally reappeared and fell to his knees in front of them. His breath was short. "He is in one of the commander's tents. It is being guarded. There is no way we can rescue him. Coney has left, but there are over 400 soldiers still in camp." Oteka ran his hand over his close-cropped hair. "I have to try," whispered Jacob. They had survived this long because they cared about each other, a simple survival technique. But this was no suicide mission. He did not mean to die now. This new Jacob was not shy any longer. He was not a leader, not a follower either, nor was he a warrior. He was something else. He was his own person, and he was not afraid. God willing, he would fight to live, but never would he live to fight. Oteka did not even try to reason with Jacob. It was obvious that Jacob would have to see the situation for himself. "Walk beside me, shoulders back, carry your pangas," Oteka gave the commands. Heads high, shoulders squared, Jacob, Paul, and Oteka did their best to strut through the dark camp. They passed soldiers sprawling languidly around small fires, looking like corpses scattered carelessly by a small god. In the distance, they saw the outline of an open tent lit from within by a kerosene lamp and heard a radio playing softly. The flaps of the tent were up. 4 commanders sat on plastic chairs around a plastic table. These loud, rough, and crude men were in full view. The table and ground around them were littered with soda pop bottles. Oteka ducked behind a hut and motioned to Jacob and Paul to do the same. "Over there." Oteka mouthed the words and pointed to the canvas tent. There were 4 huts between the boys and the tent. A guard, chewing on a stick and gripping an AK-47, crouched in front of it. The commanders, including the one with the mustache, sat not 3 meters away from the tent Norman was imprisoned in. Oteka was right. There was no way past the commanders and the guard. Then Jacob saw her, or rather the outline of her. Hannah. Clutching a small knife, Hannah stood in front of a makeshift plastic table slicing fruit. Carefully and artistically, she placed the fruit slices on banana leaves. Jacob sniffed. He could smell meat too, goat and beef. With downcast eyes, he watched her walk over to the open tent and serve the commanders. Her work went unacknowledged. A scarf, the one she usually wore around her head, was wrapped around her waist like a belt. It was as if she wanted them to see her scars. She was right. She was beautiful, but they did not notice. The scars protected her. Jacob's hand scratched the dirt. He needed something to throw. No, that would be too obvious. How could he attract her attention? Jacob motioned to Oteka and Paul with a flat palm to wait. Crawling on all fours, he circled behind the huts, then, finally, in a mad dash, rolled behind the tent. Norn was behind the canvas wall, possibly inches away, yet Jacob had no way of telling him that he was near. The guard at the front of the tent was a meter away, maybe less. Jacob lay down in the dust and inched his way around the side of the tent. The powdery soil went up his nose. He stifled a sneeze. In this position, if he reached out with his right hand and really stretched, he'd touch the guard's foot. Chin on the ground, he watched. 1 minute Hannah was in the pool of light cast by the lamp on the table, the next she was in the shadows. Twice she almost brushed against Jacob. The third time, as she swooped past, he reached out and gently, like a wisp of wind, touched her leg. Assuming an insect had grazed her leg, Hannah leaned forward to sweep it off. If his thoughts could have spoken to her, Jacob would have been crying out, "It's me, it's me!" He grabbed her hand, squeezed it quickly, then let it go. Everything, all their lives, depended on Hannah not screaming out, not reacting in any way. He waited, heart thumping in his ears, mouth dry. Nothing. She did nothing. And then a mango fell to the ground. Hannah reached down to retrieve it and looked into Jacob's eyes. Jacob pointed, then scurried back into the darkness. Unblinking, undaunted, Hannah cut up more food, this time boiled pumpkin and okra, and again carefully placed the tray of food in front of the commanders. Casually, arms swaying at her sides and head held high, she turned, picked up an empty jerry can, and walked back into the night. They met behind a hut. Oteka, Paul, Jacob, and now Hannah. "Your friend. I have seen him. He is alive," whispered Hannah. She did not need to be told why they were there. She knew. Besides, there was no time for explanations. "We must get him out," hissed Jacob. Hannah shook her head. "There are too many commanders, and the guard?" Rage rose up suddenly in Jacob. He'd had enough of being told what he could and he could not do. He was not angry at any of them. His fury was for a world that would allow this to happen to them, a world that did not care enough to stop it from happening. "I will not leave him." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Oteka said, "We will cut through the back of the tent." "The noise," said Hannah. The rip of a panga slicing through canvas would be heard by all. "Can you turn up the radio?" Jacob lurched forward. Ideas. They needed ideas. That and bravery. "Not without being told to do so." Hannah faltered. She looked at the faces around her. Jacob, Oteka, Paul. It was as though she began to draw strength from their courage emanating from them and enveloping her. She could be courageous too. She did not want to die, but she would not fear death any longer. "Yes, I can turn up the radio." Jacob reached out and touched her hand. They both knew that she could be beaten for this, or much worse. "Come with us. Escape," whispered Jacob. Oteka and Paul nodded. "Yes," she mouthed, the word looking from one boy to another. She didn't need to think about it. Yes, yes, yes. Jacob held Hannah's hand. Oteka laid his hand on top of Jacob's and Paul's on top of his. "Family," Jacob whispered. They all nodded. There was a sound, a footstep. Motioning silently with their hands, they made plans. Oteka and Paul would walk back across the village and wait by the unguarded exit to the bush, unguarded because Oteka himself was supposed to be guarding it. Hannah would refill the jug, place it on the table, then accidentally knock over the radio. When she picked it up, she would turn up the volume. Jacob would wait until the radio blared. He would have one chance to make a clean, long cut with the panga in the thick canvas. There was no way to warn Norman. If he was sitting too close to the tent wall, Jacob's panga would slice him in half. Jacob leaned closer to Paul and whispered into his ear, "If we do not make it, tell them about us. Tell my father that I know he tried to save me. Tell everyone what happens here." Jacob felt Paul's hand on his shoulder, and then walking tall, Oteka and Paul took long strides back across the village. A brutesque, guttural voice roared behind them. One of the commanders was calling Hannah. There was much clamoring from the commander's tent. A fist hit the table. Jacob scuttled behind a hut. Hannah picked up the jerry can and ran. Again, Jacob made his way back to the tent that imprisoned Norman. He planted his feet firmly on the ground, and in a swoop lifted his panga above his head. Wait, wait, wait. The radio blared. The noise was sudden and ear-splitting. Now! Jacob brought the panga down on the canvas. Please don't let Norman be sitting too near. The canvas ripped. More yelling. The music was turned off. The commander was shouting once again. Oddly, it was the commander's shrieking, not the music, that had covered the sounds of Jacob slicing through the canvas. The yelling stopped. Then came a sudden slap, and Jacob knew that Hannah had been hit. Don't think of that now. Gripping the sides of the tent in the rear, Jacob peered inside. Norman, wide-eyed and terrified, stared back. Come, come! Jacob motioned with his hand. The boy did not move. Norman, please! Jacob mouthed the words. Could Norman see him? Frozen, the boy sat in the shadows. Jacob squeezed through the canvas wall, crawled across the dirt floor, and wrapped his arm around the boy. Norman's body vibrated, and his teeth chattered, as if he was very, very cold. Outside the tent they could hear the commander continue to berate Hannah, his mouth full of foul language. The radio was turned back on. Listen to me, Jacob murmured into Norman's ear. You must go back where we were sleeping. Oteka and Paul are there. Norman! Jacob shook him. The boy wasn't listening. I will tell you something. If I had a brother, I would like him to be you. Smart. Good at multiplication. You are my war brother. We are in a war, and we will win the war because we are good, and good people win. Then you will be my peace brother. You must go now. Still, the boy did not move. Jacob grabbed him by the shoulders and gave him a shake. Go! Tentatively, slowly, Norman nodded. Jacob rubbed Norman's head and this time whispered into his ear, Go! Norman crawled across the dirt floor and soundlessly wiggled through the gash in the canvas wall. Jacob waited. It was safer if they did not leave together, and he had to get Hannah. He counted off the seconds it would take Norman to cross the village. 100, 200, 300. Finally, Jacob inched his way through the slit in the tent and lay in the dust. The commanders were back to snorting and laughing, their fists pounding the table. The radio was playing louder than before. Again, Jacob crawled to the side of the tent. The guard was still gnawing on a stick, like a small dog chewing a bone. Jacob peeked around the edge of the tent. Hannah had been knocked to the ground. She lay there, gulping back sobs, her face contorted with pain. Stupid girl, snarled the commander. Then he turned and pointed at Jacob. You, bring us more soda. Caught, caught, caught. It was over, just like that. Every part of Jacob went dead. Run, Norman, run. Slowly Jacob stood. Thank you, God, for this time on earth. Take care of my father. With one foot poised to step out of the shadows, he stopped. The guard laid down his gun and stepped forward. Yes, sir, said the soldier. He saluted. More soda. There was no breath in Jacob's body, and surely his heart had stopped. Not him? Not him. The commander had not seen him. He eased backwards into the shadows and stood still, heart hammering, legs quaking. You, get out of my sight, the commander snarled. Whom was he talking to? Jacob saw the shadow of a black boot pull back. He winced. The boot hit Hannah in the stomach with a muffled thud. The boot drew back again, but this time Hannah rolled out of his reach. He missed. Jacob could see him clearly now, almost clearly. With one foot in the air and the other on uneven ground, the commander lost his balance. His comrades burst into hysterical laughter. Jacob crawled to the back of the far hut to wait. Along the way he picked up his panga, stood, and held it in both hands. This time he would kill. If the commanders came after her, he would, at the very least, kill one. Come, 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 Hannah, come. Jacob, wide-eyed, focused and ready, prayed. And there she was. Half standing, half stumbling, wavering soundlessly and wordlessly, she fell at Jacob's feet. Neither spoke as they listened for a moment. They waited. Nothing. The commander had gone back to his food. Now on his hands and knees, pushing his panga ahead of him, centimeter by centimeter, Jacob crawled away from the tent. Hannah followed. They crept behind one hut, then another, and another, until they were at the edge of the village parade ground, the place where Coney had given his speech. His words seemed to vibrate in this place. God is telling us that killing is right. God wants us to kill, and we will do as God tells us. Go without me. I cannot, Hannah murmured. She was clutching her ribs. She was breathless. Stand, you must stand. Jacob stood, then lifted her up as best he could. He wanted to put his arm around her to help her walk, but this was too dangerous. A boy was not allowed to touch a girl. Even in the dark, they could be caught. It's no use. I think my ribs are broken. I will hold you back, she said, choking back tears. Try. Just try. I will walk first. Follow me. They had so little time. Soon the commander would notice that Norman was gone, and there'd be no telling what would happen. The loud noise, the tear in the tent, the missing boy. The commander would put it together. These men were cruel beyond measure, hardly men at all, but they were not stupid. Jacob turned and walked ahead. With her legs trembling beneath her, Hannah walked. God help us now, Jacob prayed. Panga in hand, Jacob walked tall, unmindful of the sleeping bodies of the ground, of arms and legs, of little children curled up beside their mothers. He walked like a soldier. Soldiers did not care about girls and children, so Jacob tried not to care either. Squinting, blinking, and peering into the darkness, Jacob at last saw Norman huddled under the tree. He touched Norman's shoulder and kept on going. Soundlessly, wordlessly, Norman stood and fell into step behind Hannah. Oteka and Paul were crouching by the path that led out of the village. If they were right, they were 5-6 hours' walk from the safari lodge at Murchison Falls. If they were right. If they were on the right side of the river. Without having exchanged a word, they were all now on the only unguarded path leading out of the village. Oteka went first. Behind him came Norman, Paul, and Hannah, with Jacob bringing up the rear. Between them, they had 1 gun and 2 pangas. Jacob looked back. Behind him were his classmates. Tony, too. Was he a coward for leaving them behind? A deserter? He looked ahead, resolute, determined. Escape. That is what he had to think about. They had a good head start. No one knew. But someone knew. Jacob turned back. He felt eyes upon him. Whose? Chapter 19, The Lion's Claw. In one hand, Oteka held a gun. In the other, he brandished a panga. They had left the path hours ago. Only when the underbrush became hopelessly tangled did Oteka use the long knife to cut a swath through the bush, and even then he did so carefully. No doubt their trail could be easily followed in the daylight, but the fewer signs they left, the better. He was heading towards the river. His experience told him in which direction to go, but it was his father's words that guided him. We do share a gift, my son. We always know the right path to take. The chirps of frogs and crickets reverberated in the night air. No one spoke. The code of silence was understood. They took long strides when they could, and short steps when the ground became uneven or the bush closed in on them. Regardless, they walked in each other's footsteps. It was now a habit, and, besides, it would be very easy to get lost. The moon overhead illuminated the surrounding forest and each of them. Jacob looked up. It had been a full moon on the night the rebels stormed their school and took them from their beds. That was 3 full moons ago. 3 months. A lifetime. Perhaps 2 hours passed, maybe more. Oteka motioned for them to sit. I will climb that rock and see if I can get our bearings. He pointed to an overhang, plainly lit by moonlight. Up he went, sure of his step. Jacob and the rest sat down in the long grass to wait. Sitting among his friends, his family, Jacob felt calm. From the night of the abduction and during the whole of his captivity, he had been enveloped in a fog of fear, his whole being hurled into shock. Now, his breath was even, measured, and he felt a purpose had come to his life. Fear had grown into resolve, and resolve into courage. And then a surprise. Hannah undid the scarf that was tied tightly around her waist and revealed 4 fist-sized mangoes. Paul could barely contain himself. He almost cheered. Hannah handed them out. They were hard as nuts and barely ripe enough to eat, but delicious all the same. The combination of tart and sweet seemed to fill Jacob's mouth. He had eaten mangoes all his life, but this was the first time he had really tasted one. "This is the best mango I've ever eaten," said Paul, and then he whispered to Hannah, "Thank you." It was too dark to see her face, but Jacob saw her head and shoulders pull back as if she was astonished. "Norman, are you all right?" asked Jacob. Norman had not said a word since Jacob had found him in the tent. The boy nodded, but did not speak. Oteka reappeared. "We are on track." Jacob held out half a mango. He had taken one large bite, no more. Oteka looked at the fruit and for a moment, seemingly unable to take in his good fortune. Then he ate. It was time to leave. This time Hannah tied the scarf around her head, covering her ears, or where her ears were supposed to be. Perhaps, thought Jacob, she feels safe with us. With the LRA, she used her disfigurement to protect her. Here, with us, she needs no such protection. Paul reached out to Norman, who was hobbling badly. The bigger boy and the smaller boy walked on. Jacob's feet were causing pain too, but he had not said a word. What would be the point? Hannah let out the smallest cry, then hugged her middle with her arms. Jacob gently put his own arm around Hannah's waist. They walked. She leaned on him a little, and he leaned on her a little. Another hour passed. There was a distant sound, a far, far rumbling of thunder, but not thunder. It was too even, too consistent. Guns! Which way? Ahead or behind? They stopped to listen, heads cocked. "Waterfall!" Paul hissed. "Murchison Falls!" The sound of the waterfall grew louder with every step. Finally, the five stood on a ridge and peered into the black abyss. They could hear the river below, but they could not see it. "There!" Oteka pointed to the tracks that made up a sort of path down towards the water. Animal prints were everywhere. Slip-sliding down the hill, they followed the trail to the river's edge. They stood on trampled grass. Jacob sniffed. The river was foul and reeked. Thin rays from the moon winked off brown, sudsy water, animal pollution. "What is this river?" Jacob asked. It was Paul who answered. "The Victoria Nile." Another terrifying sound, and they all spun in their tracks. It wasn't a roar. It was a deep, menacing growl of something in anguish. Jacob's heart began to pound. Half-submerged eyes stared at them from the water. Crocodiles, dozens of them, and all meters long. A crocodile, as gnarled and crusty as an old tree, blinked, then disappeared below the surface. One croc after another sank into the river. Hardly a ripple was left behind. But crocodiles did not growl. There was something else out there. Oteka took the gun off his back, cocked it, and trained it on the surrounding bush. To fire would be madness. The sound would echo for kilometers. He would only use it if their lives were at stake. "Look!" Paul nudged Jacob. Upriver, great gray hippos lined the shore, hundreds of them. They moved like mammoth spirits from another time. "Do not get between a hippo and the water," hissed Oteka. "How do you know about hippos?" asked Paul. "My grandfather," replied Oteka, and for the first time Jacob thought he heard a longing in his voice. He trusted Oteka with his life, but really, he knew very little about him. "Do you know where we are?" Hannah spoke in a low, muted voice. "Oteka says that we are at Murchison Falls, the animal reserve," Jacob whispered. Again, Oteka volunteered to climb back up to the ridge and see if he could get their bearings. This time Paul volunteered to go too. The two set off. Exhausted, and gingerly holding her middle, Hannah lowered herself to the ground, and Norman followed her lead. Jacob saw something move out of the corners of his eyes. Then he heard it. A hiss. "Norman!" Jacob cried out. The boy leapt up. Jacob grabbed him, held him tight, and looked over Norman's shoulder. It was hard to see, but yes, it was a puff adder, a venomous snake. Disturbed and annoyed, no doubt, it slunk away. "It's gone now. It's all right," Jacob whispered into Norman's ear. The boy's heart thumped so hard that Jacob could feel it through his shirt. "Rest, rest." Gently, Jacob released him, and still quaking, Norman crumpled onto the ground. Hannah laid her hand on the boy's arm. It was not hard to guess her thoughts, as they all had the same thought. Danger was at every turn. The three sat high up on the bank among the trees that lined the river's edge. Further along, on sandy patches closer still to the water, crocodiles clustered. It took a few minutes, but slowly the fright receded, and Jacob became acutely aware of Hannah's presence. What to say to a girl? And then a thought. Hannah seemed to know all their names. How was that possible? "Do you know about Oteka?" Jacob asked quietly. "I was there when he was captured," she answered simply. "Where did they capture him?" Jacob leaned in to hear her answer. "He was walking on the road to Kampala when the rebels surrounded him. They called him a good catch, because he is so tall and strong. But it was odd. He did not fight, and he did not look scared. It was as if he expected to be abducted." A branch snapped. They caught their breath. Paul tumbled down the hill, then stumbled towards them, gasping for air. "Did you see?" Oteka came running up from behind them. "Move! Move!" he screamed. Jacob, Hannah, and Norman leapt to their feet. "Listen!" Paul pointed in a different direction. "Footsteps!" Poised to run, they stopped, listening to the almost indistinguishable sounds. Not footsteps exactly, but the sound of something moving through the bush. "Grab hold!" Oteka flung his gun to the ground, seized a dangling vine, and hoisted Hannah up into a tree. She hardly knew what was happening, but instinctively reached out and seized the branches above her head. Effortlessly, Oteka lifted Norman next. The boy was as light as air. Norman climbed up into the tree and sat beside Hannah. Paul scrambled up another tree. All three clung desperately to thin branches. The trees were not strong, and the branches were brittle. "Take this!" Oteka passed his gun up to Paul. Only Jacob and Oteka remained on the ground. "Pull!" Oteka yanked at more vines that dangled from the trees. "They must hold our weight." "Why?" Jacob had no time to ask. Oteka had a plan, and Jacob trusted him. They all did. Frantically, furiously, with more strength than he had ever used in his whole life, Jacob pulled the dangling vines. One vine after another gave way, but finally 2 strong vines held. Norman, halfway up the tree, reached down and further secured one with his hands. Paul, sitting in the tree, cocked his gun. There it was again, that sound. "What is it?" Jacob was desperate. "You go up." Oteka looked at Jacob. "It's coming." In an instant, Jacob knew. They were being stalked, and Oteka was planning to lead the animal away from them. He said, "No, I am with you." Hearts pounding, breath short, Jacob and Oteka faced each other in the dark. One was a rich boy, and the other was poor. One was big and muscular, with arms as thick as a good-sized tree branch. The other was smaller and quick, with his strength and his determination. Now they were equals, both resolute, both stubborn, both firm. And then there was no time to argue. "Run!" Oteka turned on his heels. "What is it? What is it?" Jacob ran behind him. "A lion. An old lion." They ran, Oteka stopping to listen. Huffing, Jacob crouched beside him. "Lions do not hunt people," hissed Jacob as he tried to draw air into his lungs. He knew little of wildlife, but he knew that. He looked around. Which would be worse, to be eaten by a crocodile or a lion? Old ones chased out of the pride hunt people, and this one is old and hungry. Listen. The two held their breath. Nothing. "I hear," muttered Jacob, and then, "I hear rebels. Double back, run." "No, others in danger." Jacob raced after him. There was no other route to take. On one side, the river. On the other, a riverbank of dense bush. Behind, rebels. And somewhere, the lion. Oteka stopped. "The lion will come to the smell of blood." Oteka took his panga and held it over his arm. Jacob stopped dead in his tracks. His bleeding feet. The lion was tracking him. "No." Jacob grabbed hold of Oteka's arm. "Listen." They turned towards a sound. Someone running, coming up from behind. Jacob saw him first. Red-rimmed eyes through the darkness. Lizard. "Run!" Jacob cried. They dodged left, right, then circled back towards the others, retracing their steps. Jacob's wounded, damaged feet left a trail of blood. They heard Lizard shout an order to his men. "Do not shoot!" He was spent, exhausted, and yet still Jacob understood Lizard's plan. He wanted Jacob and his followers alive. He would tether them with vines and march them back to the village. He would parade them in front of the whole camp. He would kill them slowly. He would be called a hero. He would become a full commander. There was no screaming, no war cries, not from Jacob and Oteka, nor from Lizard and his soldiers. Every breath drawn into all their lungs was put to good use. Dodging, weaving, they thrashed their way back through the bush. Barbs and thorns, as sharp as knives, drove into Jacob's feet, drawing out yet more droplets of blood and pus. Their lungs might burst, and then, there, ahead, copper eyes, jagged teeth, fur that shimmered gold in the moonlight, Jacob and Oteka spun on their heels, then looked up. Above in the trees, Hannah, Norman, and Paul waited with bated breath. The lion roared, his body lengthening to cover meters of ground. He leapt. The soldiers followed orders and did not shoot. Lizard shrieked. His soldiers scattered. Jacob dropped his panga, threw himself sideways, hands extended, and reached out for a vine. He twisted and turned, suspended and swinging. Norman and Hannah, high up in the tree, heaved and pulled, branches creaking and bending under their weight. Jacob arched his back and threw his legs over a lower tree limb. Below, the lion roared, and the screaming started. Upside down, head dangling, Jacob looked into Lizard's bloodshot eyes. In that split second, he saw something. The eyes of a boy, not a beast, just a boy. "Help me!" Lizard reached up desperately as the lion's jaws clamped on his lower half. "Paul, shoot!" Jacob screamed. Where was Paul? He had a gun. Why did he not use it? "Jacob!" Hannah screamed. "Jacob, climb higher!" Using muscles almost forgotten, Jacob scrambled up into the tree. Hannah, Norman, and Jacob held on to each other as the lion ripped apart everything still alive on the ground. Where was Oteka? Jacob cried out, "Oteka! Paul!" The branches they sat on groaned under their weight. One wrong move, and all three would plummet to the ground. The screaming below was suddenly muted. Jungle chatter ceased. Nothing remained but the sound of the lion tearing flesh from bone. Jacob, Hannah, and Norman sat still. Below, the earth turned red, and above, a white moon and a black sky watched. Finally, nonchalantly, the lion dragged away his kill. Lizard had been reduced to a bloodied leg and shoulder bone. "Oteka! Paul!" Jacob cried again, but now his cries were more like sobs. "Please, please." And then came the answer. "We are here." Jacob let go of his branch and landed on his hands and knees. The shock of it sent waves of pain throughout his battered body. One after the other, Paul and Oteka too dropped to the ground. "Go!" hissed Jacob. Oteka took the lead. Paul went after him, then Norman and Hannah. They headed upstream towards the waterfall along the river's edge. Was it the right direction? Jacob was about to say something when he remembered his panga. The thought of going back made him want to retch. He kept going, then stopped dead in his tracks. Lizard had a cell phone. Jacob spun around and retraced his steps. They had not gone far. Soon the ground under his feet was blood-soaked. His mind and body told him to run away. Blood and bone mixed in with the damp muck. With his heart pounding, he fell to his knees and ran his hands over the ground. If he could find the phone, their troubles would be over. "Father, to hear your voice again." "There!" He picked up a bit of metal. It was a belt buckle. Anger seemed to swell it up as he tossed it aside. His hands grew sticky with blood. The smell made him feel lightheaded. He tried again and found what was left of Lizard's gun. And then he touched the cell phone. His hands shook as he lifted it to his ear. He pressed button after button. Dead. He yelled and pitched the phone against a tree. "God, why do you give and take back? Why have you forgotten us?" They had to get away from this spot, had to run. There was a sound. What was it? Breathing? Someone was near. A rebel. Jacob dropped to the ground. Slowly, noiselessly, hand over hand, Jacob crawled around a tree. There it was again, sharp intakes of breath, almost as though someone was trying to stifle sobs. Jacob reached out and touched something metal. His panga. Gripping it in two hands, he reared it up and lunged towards the sound. "Ah!" he screamed. "Jacob?" As if suspended by mystical hands, Jacob came to a standstill, the panga still above his head. "Jacob?" He dropped the panga. Tony? Jacob squatted down and peered into the shadows. Knees by his ears, arms wrapped around his legs, eyes wide and silent, and gun by his side, Tony was burrowed deep into the hollowed-out roots of the jackfruit tree. "Tony, come out!" Jacob tried to quiet his own breathing. He gave his hand as a child would offer a bone to a puppy. Tony took it. In a flash, Jacob grabbed Tony's gun and slung it over his own shoulder. Tony did not object. He didn't even seem to notice. "Tony, we cannot stay here." Jacob picked up the panga, and both stood, walked, then ran silently through the bush along the river. Oteka, Hannah, Paul, and Norman, standing near the water, looked back. Even in the moonlight, Jacob could see fear on their faces. They expected one person and saw two. "Rebels!" cried Norman. Oteka cocked his gun. "It's me. It's all right. I am with Tony," Jacob called out. Fear turned into astonishment. It was hard to read Paul's face in the moonlight, but nothing could disguise his behavior. He turned his back on Tony. "Jacob," said Oteka, "we are on the wrong side of the river."